I sat in the stifling room, watching my stepmother mentally spend my father's $154 million empire. She looked at me like dirt on her designer shoes, certain I was walking away with nothing. But she did not see the old lawyer's subtle smile. She thought she was the hunter claiming her ultimate prize. She had no idea she was stepping blindly into a perfect, inescapable trap. Hello to the wonderful audience of Maya Revenge Stories. Thank you for always being here with me. Unfortunately, YouTube has recently disabled monetization on our channel, leaving us without the budget to continue operating. So we must pause uploading new videos here and move our operations to Patreon. If you enjoy today's story, please support us by joining the Maya Revenge Stories Patreon, where you can listen to exclusive, true stories that are even better, much longer, and incredibly detailed, describing situations we simply cannot publish on YouTube, fully produced with multiple emotional voice actors bringing a single story to life. You can join by scanning the QR code on your screen or by clicking the Patreon link in the video description or the pinned comment. Now, let us dive right into today's story and meet our resilient main character, Joanna Larson. The heavy elevator doors parted with a soft, melodic chime, revealing the sprawling, fiercely modern reception area of Chicago's most elite law firm, perched imposingly on the 50th floor. I stepped out onto the pristine marble, bringing with me the strange, unshakable calmness of a woman who had long ago learned to survive on her own terms. At 34 years old, I had constructed my own empire from scratch, free from the suffocating expectations and betrayals of my past. My tailored coat brushed lightly against the glass walls as I made my way down the sterile hallway toward Conference Room B. Inside that room, the air was entirely different. It was terribly stifling, thick with a cold, calculated greed that you could almost taste. Sitting at the absolute center of the massive, custom-built mahogany table was my stepmother, Evelyn. She was only 45 years old, a mere 11 years my senior. But she wore her ruthless ambition like a heavy, suffocating perfume. As the former chief financial officer of my father's sprawling company, she had always possessed a terrifying talent for manipulating balance sheets and breaking the people who stood in her way. Today, she looked the part of the triumphant, grieving widow to absolute perfection. She was draped in an immaculate designer suit, her neck and wrists weighed down by sparkling, ostentatious diamond jewelry that caught the harsh glare of the overhead lights. She positively radiated a sickening, undeniable sense of victory. Flanking Evelyn on either side were two of her own private paralegals. They sat with rigid posture, resembling loyal, well-paid attack dogs. Their leather briefcases were already snapped open, revealing meticulously organized stacks of legal documents and asset transfer papers. They were fully prepared to aggressively absorb the entirety of my late father, Arthur Larson's massive corporate estate. It was a legendary enterprise valued at a staggering $154 million, and Evelyn was already glaring at the paperwork as if that fortune was her own personal checking account. As soon as I pulled out a heavy wooden chair on the opposite, isolated side of the table, Evelyn leaned forward. Her meticulously manicured fingers drummed against the polished wood, and her eyes narrowed into a sharp, predatory glare. She could never resist an opportunity to twist the knife. "I am honestly amazed the security guards even let you up here, Joanna," Evelyn said, her voice dripping with venomous, unchecked sarcasm. "After you packed your pathetic little suitcase and abandoned your father 10 years ago, I figured you would finally have the common decency to stay away. But I suppose the scent of a massive fortune brings out the desperation in everyone, even someone as high and mighty as you." She let out a short, theatrical laugh, glancing sideways at her hired assistants, who eagerly offered synchronized, mocking smirks. "Let me save you the agonizing suspense," Evelyn continued, crossing her arms defensively over her chest. "A runaway failure who turned her back on her own flesh and blood is not getting a single red cent from this will. You walked away from a $154 million legacy a whole decade ago. Did you honestly think crawling back into this city today would magically change history? You are wasting everyone's time." I did not flinch. I did not offer her the satisfaction of a single defensive reaction. My face remained a perfectly unreadable mask, carved from pure ice. I let her harsh words hang in the dead, silent air of the room, completely ignoring her desperate, pathetic attempts to provoke me. Instead, my gaze bypassed her entirely and settled quietly on the empty chair at the head of the table. Resting neatly next to it was a deeply weathered leather briefcase. It belonged to Mr. Vance. He was the fiercely loyal family attorney who had tirelessly served the Larson family and protected my father's most sensitive business interests for 30 long years. That battered briefcase was the only authentic, honorable thing in this entire room. Right on cue. The heavy oak doors groaned open. Mr. Vance stepped into the room, and the entire atmosphere immediately plummeted, growing colder, heavier, and infinitely more serious. The smug, victorious grin instantly vanished from Evelyn's face as she forcefully straightened her posture, suddenly pretending to be the devastated, fragile widow. Mr. Vance looked terribly exhausted, the profound weight of my father's death clearly taking a physical toll on his aging shoulders. Yet his dark eyes remained as sharp and unyielding as ever. He walked slowly to his designated seat, gently setting his wrinkled hands on the worn leather of his briefcase. The room grew so completely silent that you could vividly hear the faint, muffled hum of the chaotic city traffic 50 stories below, with absolute practiced deliberation. Mr. Vance unclasped the dual brass locks of his bag. He reached inside and slowly withdrew a thick, cream-colored envelope, securely sealed with a heavy, intimidating stamp of red wax. Before he broke that final seal, Mr. Vance lifted his heavy head. His sharp, calculating eyes methodically scanned the room, sliding coldly past Evelyn and her two corporate hired guns until they landed directly on me. For one fleeting, incredibly intense second, his gaze locked firmly with mine. There was something hidden in that brief, quiet look, a silent, powerful acknowledgement, a terrifying shadow of something monumental waiting to unfold. Then, he looked down at the parchment. "We are gathered here today to execute the final will and testament of Arthur Larson." Mr. Vance announced, his deep voice echoing with absolute, undeniable authority. "Let us begin." The name Arthur Larson used to mean something profound in the American industrial landscape. My father was not merely a businessman chasing quarterly profits. He was a brilliant, uncompromising engineer. He single-handedly founded Apex Horizon Industries, transforming a modest Midwest operation into a global titan of construction materials technology. He understood the fundamental integrity of concrete and steel far better than he ever understood the complexities of human nature. That was the singular foundation of his immense success, and ultimately, it became his most fatal, tragic flaw. When I was 24 years old, I was working as a junior architect within the sprawling corporate headquarters of Apex. I worshipped the ground my father built his empire upon and fully intended to dedicate my life to expanding his vision. But that exact same year, he married his chief financial officer. Evelyn was charming on the surface, but underneath, she was aggressively ambitious and entirely ruthless. It did not take long for me to notice the subtle, terrifying shifts in our corporate ecosystem. I started digging deeply into the internal project logs and uncovered a labyrinth of financial discrepancies. Evelyn was systematically cooking the books, draining clean corporate capital to fund highly unethical, aggressively risky offshore developments. She was substituting premium materials with cheap, unregulated alternatives on major infrastructure bids, pocketing the massive profit margins while putting the company at severe legal and structural risk. I spent 3 agonizing, sleepless weeks compiling a bulletproof dossier. I painstakingly traced every hidden transaction, every manipulated forecast, and every forged authorization signature. I walked directly into my father's corner office, slammed the heavy binder onto his mahogany desk, and laid out the absolute, undeniable truth. I fully expected him to be furious. I expected him to call corporate security and have her removed from the building on the spot. Instead, He looked at me with a mixture of profound exhaustion and deep, misplaced disappointment. Evelyn had gotten to him first. She had already planted the insidious seeds of doubt, weaving a masterful emotional narrative that painted me as a jealous, resentful daughter desperately trying to sabotage his newfound happiness. My father, completely blinded by his late-in-life infatuation and her perfectly fabricated financial audits, flatly refused to look at my evidence. He pushed my binder aside without opening a single page. "I will not let your petty jealousy tear this new family apart. Joanna," he had said, his voice echoing with a cold, final authority. "Evelyn is modernizing this company. You need to learn your place and stop these baseless accusations." There were no dramatic screaming matches. I did not drop to my knees and beg him to see the truth. Nor did I shed a single tear of victimhood. The very moment he chose her fabricated lies over my concrete evidence, the father I knew ceased to exist. My personal pride and professional ethics were worth infinitely more than his misplaced loyalty. I calmly walked back to my desk, drafted a sharp, two-sentence letter of resignation, and left it squarely on my keyboard. I packed my apartment in complete silence and drove out of Chicago that exact same night, leaving the towering skyline of my father's empire shrinking in my rearview mirror. I headed south, eventually settling in the warm, moss-draped city of Savannah, Georgia. I arrived with absolutely nothing but my architectural degree and a burning, relentless desire to build something that was entirely mine. Over the next 10 years, I poured every ounce of my energy into starting over from absolute scratch. I founded a historical architectural restoration firm, taking crumbling, forgotten antebellum estates and breathing life back into their foundations. My business did not just survive, it thrived immensely. I became a highly sought-after expert across the region, running a highly profitable, self-sustaining operation. I was living a beautifully independent, self-made life, completely severed from the toxic, suffocating wealth of the Larson name. For an entire decade, the sprawling chasm between my father and me remained firmly intact. The only fragile threads connecting us were the sterile, generic postcards he mailed to my office every single year on my birthday. I never replied to a single one. I never looked back. I had buried Arthur Larson in my mind a long time ago. That absolute, heavy silence remained unbroken until exactly 3 days ago. I was standing on the high scaffolding of a late 19th century courthouse restoration project when my phone vibrated with an urgent, frantic call from Chicago Memorial Hospital. The attending physician informed me that my father had suffered a massive, catastrophic stroke and was in critical condition. His body was rapidly failing, and the narrow window for his survival was closing by the hour. The invincible empire he built was finally cracking, and the man who pushed me away a decade ago was suddenly running out of time. I caught the first available red-eye flight out of Georgia. Touching down at the airport, at exactly 3 in the morning, I rented a car and drove aggressively through the empty streets, racing straight to the intensive care unit of Chicago Memorial Hospital. But I never even made it to his room. Evelyn had already anticipated my arrival and fortified the entire floor. 2 massive private security contractors in tailored dark suits stood firmly in front of the double doors leading to his wing. When I demanded to see my father, the taller guard simply crossed his arms and informed me that only the current Mrs. Larson was authorized to permit visitors. Evelyn was deliberately running out the clock. She was isolating him in his final, fading hours just to ensure I could not whisper a single word of reconciliation or perhaps uncover a hidden truth before he took his last breath. Instead of causing a scene that she could use against me in a legal battle, I swallowed my burning anger and stepped back. I retreated to a sterile, poorly lit waiting room at the end of the corridor, pacing the cold linoleum floor in the dead of the night. Suddenly, an older nurse in worn blue scrubs approached me. She moved cautiously, glancing nervously down the empty hallway before she quickly pressed a small, freezing metallic object directly into my palm. It was a heavy brass safe deposit key, wrapped tightly inside a folded piece of white medical tape. "Your father paid for my daughter's college tuition 20 years ago," the nurse whispered, her voice trembling but resolute, barely audible over the hum of the ventilation system. He made me swear to give you this if his wife ever tried to lock you out. Before I could ask a single question, she turned and hurried away down the hall. I peeled back the sticky tape. There was no address printed inside, no lengthy explanation of what the key unlocked. There was just a string of geographic coordinates scribbled hastily in my father's unmistakable, jagged handwriting. I left the hospital immediately. I drove my rental car straight into the freezing, pre-dawn darkness of the city. The coordinates led me far away from the glittering, wealthy downtown skyline. They guided me deep into an abandoned, decaying industrial district on the far south side. I eventually pulled up to a massive, crumbling red brick warehouse. It was the exact same building where my father had started his very first concrete testing laboratory over 40 years ago. The rusted metal side door groaned violently as I pushed it open, stepping into a cavernous space smelling of damp earth and old memories. Inside, hidden beneath a heavy canvas tarp in his old, dilapidated corner office, was a heavy fireproof floor safe. The brass key slid perfectly into the slot. The heavy locking mechanism clicked open with a satisfying, heavy thud. Inside the dark chamber sat a massive, intimidating stack of confidential auditing files. They were not the sanitized, optimistic corporate reports Evelyn proudly presented to the board of directors. These were raw, aggressive, forensic financial investigations my father had secretly commissioned over the last 2 years. As I flipped through the dense pages by the weak, yellow light of my mobile phone, the terrifying scope of Evelyn's ultimate betrayal became crystal clear. She had not just skimmed a little cash off the top to fund a lavish lifestyle. She had aggressively embezzled tens of millions of dollars through a complex web of phantom offshore shell companies. But that was not the worst part. To cover her massive, glaring cash deficits, she had secretly mortgaged every single core asset of Apex Horizon Industries. She had leveraged the very soul of the company against highly toxic, predatory corporate loans, the magnificent, invincible empire my father built was completely hollowed out. It was a rotting carcass, bleeding to death from the inside out, completely drowning in catastrophic debt. At the very bottom of the safe, completely buried beneath the financial ruin, lay a single, crisp envelope addressed to me. I tore it open. The ink on the thick parchment was slightly smudged, as if written with a trembling hand. "My dearest Joanna," the letter read, "you were right about her. You were right about absolutely everything all those years ago. My foolish, arrogant pride blinded me, and it cost me the only true daughter I ever had. I do not expect your forgiveness, but I desperately need you to know I am not letting her win. Over the past 18 months, I have meticulously set a perfect trap for the greedy. All you have to do is show up, hold your ground, and let the jaws snap shut." Before I could even begin to process the sheer, terrifying magnitude of his hidden crusade, my phone buzzed violently in my coat pocket. It was the hospital administrator. Arthur Larson had just passed away. He died at exactly 6:15 in the morning, entirely alone in a room guarded by strangers. I carefully folded his final letter, placed it securely into my inner breast pocket, and walked out of the freezing warehouse as the gray sun began to rise over the industrial ruins. 3 days later, I attended his funeral. The Chicago sky was an unbroken sheet of oppressive gray, pouring freezing, relentless rain over the sprawling elite cemetery. Evelyn stood prominently by the polished mahogany casket, putting on a spectacular performance. She hid her fake, non-existent tears behind a black designer veil, gripping the arms of sympathetic board members and playing the heartbroken widow to absolute perfection. I stood entirely alone at the far edge of the burial plot, completely unprotected from the rain. I did not shed a single tear. I did not speak a single word of comfort or greeting to anyone who passed by. My silence was absolute, heavy, and terrifying. I was simply waiting, holding my breath, mentally preparing myself for the final, brutal curtain call at the lawyer's office. The snap of the crimson wax seal, breaking open, sounded like a small gunshot in the suffocating silence of the 50th floor conference room. Mr. Vance unfolded the heavy, crisp parchment with agonizing slowness. across the polished mahogany table. Evelyn leaned so far forward that her elaborate diamond necklace clinked sharply against the edge of the wood. Her eyes were burning with a desperate, ravenous hunger, fixated entirely on the black ink that held the fate of a legendary fortune. Her two hired paralegals hovered over her shoulders like anxious vultures waiting to feast, pens poised over their leather-bound notepads. Mr. Vance adjusted his reading glasses, cleared his throat, and began to read in a dry, deliberate monotone that resonated off the soundproof glass walls. I, Arthur Larson, being of sound mind and disposing memory, hereby declare this to be my last will and testament. Mr. Vance recited, his voice steady and unhurried. To my wife, Evelyn Larson, who stood beside me in the final chapter of my life, I leave full, unencumbered corporate control and single ownership of Apex Horizon Industries, along with all attached commercial holdings, and the full title to our primary suburban Chicago estate. The words had barely left his lips before Evelyn erupted into a sharp, piercing laugh that shattered the somber atmosphere of the room. She slammed her open palm down onto the table with a loud, reverberating smack, causing her paralegals to jump in surprise. The sheer, unrestrained triumph on her face was grotesque. She threw her head back, gasping for breath amidst her fits of joyous laughter, basking in what she truly believed was her ultimate, undisputed victory. "I knew it!" Evelyn shouted, her voice echoing off the high ceiling as she pointed a manicured, diamond-encrusted finger directly across the table at me. "I knew the old fool would do the right thing in the end. Did you hear that, Joanna? Read it again. Mr. Vance, let her soak in every single syllable." She leaned across the table, her face twisted into a mask of unadulterated malice, her dark eyes gleaming with vicious satisfaction. $154 million, Evelyn hissed, her voice dripping with toxic arrogance. $154 million of pure, unadulterated power and wealth, and every single cent of it belongs to me. The entire empire, the real estate, the legacy, all mine. And what do you have to show for yourself, Joanna? 10 years of rotting in the sweltering heat of Georgia, scraping paint off filthy, decaying old houses like a glorified carpenter. She turned aggressively to the head paralegal sitting to her right, snapping her fingers with sharp impatience. "Draft an immediate, binding security order right now," Evelyn commanded loudly, not taking her eyes off me for a fraction of a second. "Revoke her visitor credentials this very instant. Have building security escort this pathetic loser off the premises the second we step out of this room. I do not want her dirty shoes scuffing the marble floors of my corporate headquarters ever again." The paralegal rapidly scribbled down her orders, nodding like a loyal sycophant. Throughout her loud, obnoxious tirade, I remained completely, unnervingly motionless. I did not blink. I did not shift in my chair. My spine was straight, my posture impeccable, and my face remained as cold and expressionless as carved granite. My hands rested calmly on the mahogany surface, fingers gently laced together in a posture of complete, unshakable patience. Evelyn was utterly intoxicated by her own illusions. She was so blinded by her greed and her desperate need to humiliate me that she failed to notice the sheer emptiness of her prize. She had no idea that I had stood in that cold, damp South Side warehouse just 3 days ago. She did not know that I had touched the heavy, fireproof safe and held the true, horrifying auditing records in my own hands. She believed she had just captured this golden crown of an empire, completely oblivious to the reality that she was desperately clinging to a burning, sinking ship. I let her drink her fill of her fake glory. I let her revel in the intoxicating high of her perceived triumph. Sitting in absolute silence as she continued to gloat and mock my self-made life in Savannah, I was simply holding my ground, waiting patiently for the heavy trapdoor to spring shut beneath her designer heels. Eventually, the room settled back into a tense, heavy silence as Evelyn ran out of breath, fanning herself dramatically with her jewel-encrusted hand, a triumphant smirk permanently plastered across her face. Slowly, deliberately, Mr. Vance reached up with both hands. He lifted his gold-rimmed reading glasses from the bridge of his nose and placed them gently onto the open document before him. He pulled a crisp, white linen handkerchief from his breast pocket and began to clean the lenses with agonizingly calm, rhythmic motions. He lifted his heavy, weathered head, his dark eyes locking onto Evelyn as she sat high in her throne of victory. And then, right before our eyes, something extraordinary happened. The stern, exhausted lines on the old lawyer's face softened, and a subtle, knowing, almost terrifying smile slowly began to curve the corners of his lips. It was not a warm smile. It was the calm, lethal smile of a grandmaster who had just watched his opponent make the ultimate, irreversible mistake on the board. Mr. Vance cleared his throat. It was a single, dry, unassuming cough, but it instantly extinguished the manic, echoing sounds of Evelyn celebrating her fabricated victory. The heavy silence that followed was suffocating, pulling the oxygen straight out of the room. "Please calm yourself, Mrs. Larson," Mr. Vance said, his voice entirely devoid of warmth, cutting through the stagnant air like a scalpel. "The reading of the testament is not yet finished. What you have just so eagerly claimed is merely a decoy, a shell." Evelyn froze. Her jeweled hand hovered halfway in the air, her face twisting into a mask of pure, unadulterated confusion. The two paralegals beside her stopped writing, their pens hovering uselessly over their legal pads. "What on earth are you talking about?" Evelyn snapped, her voice trembling slightly, the polished veneer of the grieving widow beginning to crack. "You just read it yourself. I own the company. I own everything. You own a name on a piece of paper. Mrs. Larson." Mr. Vance corrected her, his tone dropping an octave, ringing with the absolute, terrifying authority of a judge handing down a life sentence. "Exactly 18 months ago, upon discovering a series of catastrophic, highly illegal financial irregularities hidden within the corporate ledgers, your late husband quietly invoked a highly classified emergency clause buried deep within the original founding charter of the corporation." The color began to drain rapidly from Evelyn's face, leaving her perfectly applied makeup looking stark and unnatural against her suddenly pale skin. Her eyes darted wildly between the lawyer and the documents on the table. Mr. Vance did not rush. He delivered each word with lethal precision, driving the nails into her coffin one by one. "Acting under absolute executive privilege, Arthur Larson initiated a total corporate divestiture," he explained, holding her terrified gaze. "He systematically severed the liquid assets. He meticulously transferred every single clean dollar, every foundational engineering patent, every unencumbered piece of commercial real estate, and all operational cash flow into a completely independent, tightly sealed legal entity." Evelyn was hyperventilating now, her chest heaving as she gripped the edges of the mahogany table. The magnificent diamond necklace around her throat suddenly looked less like a crown jewel and more like a heavy, suffocating collar. "The Apex Horizon Industries that you just inherited is nothing but a hollow shell," Mr. Vance continued, his voice unrelenting. "It is a dry, rotting corpse of a company. It has been surgically stripped of all intrinsic value. What remains within the corporate structure you just claimed is the entirety of the toxic, highly leveraged mortgage debt, the very same catastrophic debts that were fraudulently acquired through phantom offshore accounts over the past 2 years, debts secured by financial authorizations and loan guarantees that you personally signed and orchestrated." Evelyn abruptly shoved her heavy wooden chair backward. It shrieked violently against the marble floor as she stood up, her entire body shaking with a mixture of terror and blinding rage. The composed, arrogant queen from 5 minutes ago had completely vanished, replaced by a desperate, cornered animal. "No!" Evelyn screamed, slamming her fists onto the table, completely abandoning all pretense of dignity. "That is impossible. That is illegal. Where is it? Where is the money? Vance, where is the $154 million? Mr. Vance did not flinch at her outburst. Instead, the subtle, terrifying smile returned to his weathered face. It was the smile of a man who had waited a very long time to deliver justice. He slowly reached into the dark depths of his battered leather briefcase and pulled out a thick, blue-backed legal binder. He did not pass it to Evelyn. He slid the heavy binder smoothly across the polished wood, pushing it directly toward me. The entirety of the $154 million in clean assets has been securely parked inside an irrevocable, heavily fortified legal structure, Mr. Vance announced, his voice echoing with profound finality. It is legally registered as the Larson Rebuild Trust, and the sole uncontested beneficiary of this trust, as well as the newly appointed chairman of the board, holding absolute unquestionable executive control over every single asset, is Ms. Joanna Larson. I looked down at the binder resting perfectly in front of me. I slowly unlaced my fingers, reaching out to rest my hand flat against the cool, smooth cover of the trust document. I finally raised my eyes and looked directly at Evelyn. The absolute devastation on her face was a masterpiece. Evelyn let out a raw, guttural sound of pure panic. She lunged across the table, desperately snatching the thick stack of financial disclosures out of her paralegal's hands. Her eyes scanned the dense legal text with frantic, terrifying speed. The reality of the trap was finally sinking in, crushing her beneath its immense weight. She was reading the irrefutable proof that she had been utterly destroyed. She did not have a single cent to her name. She had inherited a worthless corporate title tied directly to a mountain of fraudulent loans. She was now the sole owner of a completely bankrupt entity, making her entirely and personally liable for tens of millions of dollars in toxic debt. The very embezzlement scheme she had orchestrated to steal my father's fortune was now a burning building, and she had just eagerly locked herself inside. Evelyn's hands shook violently as she gripped the edges of the trust documents. Her perfectly manicured nails dug into the heavy parchment, fully prepared to tear the undeniable proof of her destruction into 1,000 meaningless pieces. But before she could even rip the very first page, the heavy oak doors of the conference room burst open. The impact was so forceful, it rattled the thick glass walls. 2 federal agents, clad in tactical windbreakers, bearing the bold yellow letters of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, marched directly into the room. They moved with swift, uncompromising authority, instantly surrounding Evelyn's chair. "Evelyn Larson," the lead agent announced, his voice booming over her panicked gasps. "You are under arrest for massive wire fraud, corporate embezzlement, and the systemic forgery of financial authorizations." The final, missing piece of my father's puzzle snapped flawlessly into place. The cryptic letter and the mountain of auditing records hidden inside that freezing warehouse were never meant for me to use in a desperate civil lawsuit. They were merely a personal confession from a dying man. Mr. Vance had already delivered the original, heavily authenticated copies directly to the federal authorities over 6 months ago, meticulously coordinating this exact moment to ensure there was absolutely no escape. Evelyn shrieked as the federal agents forcefully pulled her arms behind her back. The sharp, metallic click of cold steel handcuffs echoed loudly through the room, a sound of absolute poetic justice. Her expensive diamond bracelets clattered uselessly against the heavy restraints. The 2 paralegals had already backed away against the wall, their faces pale, desperately trying to distance themselves from a sinking, doomed criminal. As they dragged her toward the door, Evelyn dug her expensive heels into the marble floor. She twisted her body around, her immaculate makeup completely ruined, tears of pure terror streaming down her face. All her previous arrogance, all her venomous superiority, had completely evaporated into thin air. She looked at me with wild, desperate eyes, practically dropping to her knees. "Joanna, please," she begged, her voice cracking into a pathetic, high-pitched sob. "Please, you have to stop them. We are family. I can fix this. Just give me a chance to explain." I did not flinch. I slowly stood up from my heavy wooden chair, with calm, practiced deliberation. I reached down and fastened the center button of my tailored suit jacket. I looked down at the trembling, ruined woman who had tried to steal my family's soul, and I finally broke my silence. "You were entirely right earlier today, Evelyn," I said, my voice echoing with icy, absolute precision. I received absolutely nothing from my father's $154 million estate because my father did not leave me money. He left me a sword, and he trusted me to use it to finish you. Evelyn let out a hollow, defeated wail as the agents hauled her out of the room. The heavy oak doors swung shut behind them, abruptly cutting off her desperate cries, leaving behind nothing but the profound, peaceful silence of total victory. Mr. Vance released a long, heavy breath, the immense weight of the past 2 years finally lifting from his weary shoulders. He walked slowly around the mahogany table and warmly extended his hand. As I shook it, he reached into his jacket pocket and retrieved a heavy, silver fountain pen. It was my father's absolute favorite pen, the exact one he used to sign the original founding charter of his empire. Mr. Vance pressed it firmly into my palm, marking a silent, powerful transfer of true authority. I did not stay in Chicago to revel in the sprawling corporate penthouses or the lavish suburban estates. The cold, ruthless world of high finance was never my home. Using the absolute power vested in me by the trust, I immediately liquidated the toxic remnants of the old corporation, completely purging the corrupt executives Evelyn had hired and securing generous severance packages and transition funds to protect every single loyal employee my father had cherished. Then, I went back south. 6 months later, I stood under the brilliant, warm sun of Savannah, Georgia. I was not merely scraping paint off crumbling mansions anymore. I was standing at the center of a massive, multi-acre construction site, overseeing the development of a sweeping, beautifully designed affordable housing neighborhood. Every single brick, every wooden beam, and every community center was fully funded by the Larson Rebuild Trust. I took a deep breath of the sweet, coastal air, looking up at the bright blue sky with a genuine smile. I had not just survived the vicious greed of my past, I had transformed it, fiercely protecting my own ideals while finally redeeming the true, honorable legacy of Arthur Larson. Thank you so much to everyone for listening to this story. To the very end, where in the world are you tuning in from today? Please let me know in the comments below. If you found today's story captivating, I have an important request. As I mentioned earlier, YouTube has unfortunately disabled our channel's monetization, meaning we no longer have the budget to operate here. We will not be uploading any new videos on this platform for the foreseeable future, and we are moving our entire operation to Patreon. Please help us survive and continue our work by joining the Maya Revenge Stories Patreon. There, you can listen to our absolute best, exclusive true stories that are much longer and describe intense, highly detailed situations that we simply cannot publish on YouTube. You can join us right now by scanning the Patreon QR code currently on your screen, or by using the link provided in the description and the pinned comment of this video. Thank you again from the bottom of my heart, and I hope to see you all there.